change from the grassroots that targets the most vulnerable people. It's not something that needs to be done today. It's not something that needs to be done tomorrow. It's something that needed to be done 20 years ago. And we have just sat on this globally. And so the inertia needs to be changed.
Thank you so much for being here and shedding light on this important topic. I also want to thank all of the audience who listened patiently. Thank you so much. Allah Hafiz.
And we'll try to make sure that everyone, is able to add their piece equally. So with that, I'll start off with the first section, establishing an understanding of growth. And the first question I have is for Dr. Bari, Saqib Saab, and Hina. When we talk about growth, we are talking about economic growth here. But the definition of growth, which is change in GDP as we discussed, there are a lot of constituent components, right? So you have in population growth, you have growth in investment, you have demographic changes, consumption patterns, spending. Just looking at the formula for GDP, there are different ways to measure it, but there are a lot of constituent components. And while economic growth can help improve living standards, we don't always view all kinds of growth as positive, right? We have get worried about overconsumption is a concern. So in your minds, when we're looking at growth, what are the key factors, number one, which you think contribute to economic growth? And is there a minimum necessary or a sufficient set of economic growth factors? And are there any conditions which are required to make sure that that growth is net positive? So over to you, Dr. Bari, Saqib Saab, Hina, and then any of the others as well, please.
Thank you, Dr. Bari. Thank you, Harun. So, is it all right if we break up into Urdu and, obviously, because आपने कहा कि टेक्निकल डिस्कशन होगी. लेट मी जस्ट क्वालिफाई, एटलीस्ट मेरी तरफ से तो टेक्निकल नहीं होगी, ज़्यादा पॉलिटिकल होगी, बिकॉज हमारे जो मसले मसाइल हैं ना वो सारे इकोनॉमिक्स में नहीं हैं जितने पॉलिटिक्स में. बट आई विल ट्राई टू आंसर योर स्पेसिफिक क्वेश्चंस एंड आई एम श्योर बाद में थोड़ी सी वो डिस्कशन हो सकती है. बट nested within this is the politics. So let me just say first कि not just in Pakistan, but हमारे जो policy makers around the world, ख़ास तौर पे about 1970s, late 70s से China की rise का बाद ख़ास तौर पे, but perhaps a bit earlier as well, we've been really fixated on growth around the world. Policy makers are fixated on growth. And I think a distinction has to be made between growth and development, which you've alluded to. So many countries like Pakistan, so Pakistan is actually unique in many senses, और हारून ने थोड़ा सा उसका अंदिया दिया. पहली बात है कि we've not had sustained periods of growth, unlike Vietnam and Bangladesh and India and China, etc. Some of the other high developing countries. They've had growth rates of in excess of 7-8% for 17 years, 22 years, 15 years consistently. And that's given rise to a lot of people coming out of poverty, and then this large middle class, which then has driven their growth forward. So Pakistan की केस में ये नहीं हुआ, और हम बात करेंगे कि क्यों नहीं हुआ, बाद में करते हैं. हमारा boom bust cycle है. So on average, Pakistan has accelerated at about 5-6% touch करते हैं. अब वो और भी कम हो गया, lack of investment की वजह से. Now our balance of payments constraint kicks in at about 3.8 to 4% of GDP growth. So every time we exceed this, we run into a balance of payments crisis. And this used to be around 6% in the past because we didn't have export-led growth. And we didn't have productivity-led growth, right? So investment become the, productivity become the, और उसकी बहुत सारी वजूहात थी. So many of them in the politics. So we'll talk about that later. So I think that distinction is really important. And I think keep in mind there are countries who have not pursued growth as a strategy, and they're better off than Pakistan, at least from my perspective. And I'll give you 2 examples. और मैं जब भी example देता हूँ, खास तौर पे मैं इस्लामाबाद में बैठता हूँ, तो मैं इस्लामाबाद में जब example देता हूँ, तो people drop off their chairs and say, यार ये कौन से अपने example दे दिए? Pakistan is not going to emulate. But the 2 examples I'll give you that are better than Pakistan without pursuing a growth strategy: Cuba and Iran. Now these are really, sort of different examples, but एक शहरी के नाते से आप एक उसकी प्रिज्म से देखें, and then I'll tell you why Cuba is better than Pakistan. They have a much better healthcare system than Pakistan. They spend more on education in Pakistan. पाकिस्तानी बच्चे मेडिसिन पढ़ने के लिए क्यूबा जाते थे. आई डोंट नो अभी भी जाते हैं या नहीं, डॉक्टर साहब को पता होगा कि अब उनका क्या सिचुएशन है. रशिया भी जाते थे, क्यूबा, बेलारूस भी जाते हैं, जहाँ भी उनको मिलता है. बट क्यूबा वाज वन ऑफ द प्लेसेस वेयर पाकिस्तानी डॉक्टर्स हैव बीन ट्रेन्ड इन द 60s and 70s. सो दे फोकस्ड ऑन ह्यूमन डेवलपमेंट. एंड आई थिंक हम अगर अमर्त्य सेन की बात जहन में रखें, he said, the ultimate aim of development is to make lives worth living, right? Pakistan could have growth rates of 6-7%. Our lives are never worth living because हम किसी खाते में नहीं आए as citizens, right? वहाँ they've put people-centric growth at the top, and Iran is the same. Iran के ऊपर sanctions हैं, जो भी है, but despite that, their industrial base is stronger than Pakistan, their healthcare system is better than Pakistan, their education system is better than Pakistan. So I think there's a lot to unpack and think of. This growth fixation, it needs to be deconstructed, and we need a people-centric approach to development rather than just growth.
So साकिब ने जो बात की, इसी को आगे बढ़ाता हूँ. देखें, अगर आप 1940-30 से देखना शुरू करें सारी डिबेट ग्रोथ पे, तो पहले यही था ना कि ग्रोथ, जीडीपी, ये वो. लेकिन इवन बाय 60s हमें महसूस होना शुरू किया, यहाँ भी, इवन पाकिस्तान में भी रिपोर्ट्स आनी शुरू हो गई थी ऑफ कंसंट्रेशन ऑफ वेल्थ. महबूब उल हक साहब का पेपर भी आया था उस पर. उसके बाद फिर भी टर्न टूवर्ड्स कि भाई ह्यूमन डेवलपमेंट जो है वो कहाँ से, उसका सारा पैराडाइम फिर आया. फिर जो इंडोजिनस ग्रोथ का आइडिया है वो चल पड़ा, एंड सो ऑन एंड सो फोर्थ. एंड दैट्स अ रिचनेस इन द डिबेट दैट हैज़ कम ओवर टाइम विद फोकसिंग अ लॉट मोर ऑन दिस, कि भाई ये जो हम कोशिश कर रहे हैं समझने की कि सोसाइटी किस तरफ जाना चाहती है वो है क्या. और इसकी एक सिंपल सी एग्जांपल मैं आपको ऐसे भी देता हूँ कि अगर आप किसी से पूछें, आप किसी से मिलते हैं, उससे पूछते हैं क्या हाल है, तो वो ये तो नहीं कहता कि भाई मैं इस दफ़ा 7% मेरी इनकम ऊपर गई है और ये हुआ है और वो हुआ है. वो आपको अपनी सेहत के बारे में बताएगा, बच्चों की तालीम के बारे में बताएगा, वो ये बताएगा कि ज़िंदगी कैसी गुजर रही है. दोज आर द थिंग्स दैट आर एंड्स इन देमसेल्व्स, राइट? सो वी वांट ग्रोथ फॉर ends that matter to humans, and those ends have to do with how good is a life for us. So Chinese growth matters because within 2 generations, from grandfather to grandchild, they've been able to transform those outcomes. We can have a debate on the cost and so on, that's a separate issue, but they have really over 30-40 years transformed the lives of citizens and individuals significantly in terms of health outcomes, education outcomes, quality of life outcomes, and that's what matters. And that's why double-digit growth, जिसकी आपने भी जिक्र किया चाइना की, matters a lot. They have lifted more people out of poverty than probably we have over the century in the rest of the world and so on, close to those numbers, right? So वो एक चीज़ important. लेकिन दूसरा जो aspect इसका बहुत important है इसी ग्रोथ में से, कि अगर आपने ग्रोथ सस्टेन भी करनी है तो देयर इज अ फंक्शनल इंपॉर्टेंस ऑफ हेल्थ एंड एजुकेशन एंड सो ऑन which comes squarely into the growth process itself. So causality जो है वो goes from growth to education and health back to growth also. और ये दोनों established in literature में है. हम पढ़ाना चाहते हैं सबको, उनको सेहतमंद देखना चाहते हैं, वरना हमारी प्रोडक्टिविटी कैसे बढ़ेगी. और आतिफ मियाँ का काफ़ी इंसिस्टेंस है कि प्रोडक्टिविटी इज़ द की कंस्ट्रेंट दैट इज़ कीपिंग आवर ग्रोथ बूम बस साइकिल में भी. तो वो क्यों हो रहा है? इसीलिए कि ना हमारे पास पढ़े लिखे लोग हैं, ना स्किल्ड लोग हैं, ना उनकी सेहत अच्छी है. तो फिर वो ग्रोथ सस्टेन कैसे हम करेंगे? सीपेक से नहीं होगी, किसी फॉरेन इम्पेटस से नहीं होगी, किसी डिफेंस पैक्ट से नहीं होगी, किसी ऐसी किस्म की चीज़, मिनरल्स एक्सपोर्ट करने से नहीं होगी. होना यहीं के लोगों को पढ़ा के सेहतमंद बना के उसी से होना पड़ेगा. लेट मी स्टॉप एंड वी कैन देन कम बैक.
Please add.
The previous two speakers have, made an excellent sort of point about, questioning what kind of growth we're pursuing and how do we define that growth. And I feel like the classic answer is like you need more investment, you need investment in human capital, you need more exports, you need good quality of investment, credible institutions and implementation. But I feel like I'll just talk about 3-4 points that I feel are missing when you, or slip through the cracks when you're looking at what drives growth in Pakistan. We always look at inclusion as a second thought, or like as something that it's charity that we're doing, or we don't realize that it's a key driver of growth, not just an outcome of growth. And which is why we see that women participation in the labor force today is much lower than our South Asian counterparts. We have over 20 million children who are still out of school. We have a very large young population. It's one of the fastest growing. 64% of our population is actually under 30. So what are we doing for them? They will be entering the job market. So are we really thinking about these segments of the population? 70% of our population is working in the informal sector. So what are we doing to include them and make them a part of this growth that we talk about? Also, I feel like the productive allocation of capital or investment, yes, we do say that we need to increase our investment from 13% to 30%. We talk about these numbers, but really, what are we investing in? Are we investing in shopping malls, and are we like in speculation, buying real estate, property? These don't create jobs. They don't, they're not productive investments. So we really need to channel these investments into health, into education, give them to SMEs, give businesses. SMEs form 90% of your, number of enterprises. They get just about 6 to 7% of the credit. So, we're starving these sectors, and which have the potential to really contribute to generating real growth for people of Pakistan. I also feel like implementation capacity itself to implement reforms is also a driver, and we will make a lot of reforms, we'll make a lot of policies, but then we will not follow through. So I think that implementation gap in building that state capacity is just as critical as making all these visions, plans and documents. And looking at the recent past, I feel resilience is also, it should be a part of the definition of how we define growth, because without resilience, we will actually undo the gains that we've made very rapidly. And we've seen this, the 2022 floods. We're still trying to, make up for the losses. It cost our GDP almost 10%. These estimates vary. We're still struggling with the 2025 floods. So I feel like we need a plan where we're built these into how we define growth. So resilience is, again, very important. Air pollution, you were saying that it's about to come. I think the smog is already here. I think we can all see it. So, the costs of air pollution, they choke the engines of growth, like our cities, Lahore and Karachi, are not able to function. It's a productivity killer. So I think that these are some elements that we need to really think about, include in the definition of growth when we talk about it.
This is fascinating because straight off the bat, the economists at the table have sort of opened up non-traditional areas. So we've talked about education, you talked about growth versus development. You did hit a little bit on the traditional points of access to capital and so on. But I do find it very interesting that we're converging on this area where we're talking about health and education and the ultimate aims of growth as the key drivers, in a way, of achieving inclusive growth, equitable growth. So I'd like to bring Umar and Sven into this discussion.
मैं एक सवाल पूछ सकता हूँ इसी हवाले से?
Yes, sure.
So the three countries that came up in the discussion as a comparison to Pakistan was China, Cuba, and Iran, and their relationship to United States and the general Western world is of a different nature than we have had historically. So I wonder what your opinion is. The three panelists who answered this question is, our relationship with the US, the way it is versus the 3 other countries that came up in the discussion, is that also a hindrance to our development, or is it not?
So you're asking the wrong person. So let me just say,
Khaja साहब ने अभी इस relationship को flirtatious कहा है मेरी हसन के interview पे, so
हमने तो बनाया हुआ है इसको. But so I'll just give you एक American president ही था, डॉक्टर साहब को शायद याद हो कौन था, मैं भूल गया हूँ. He said, being an enemy of the US is dangerous, but being friends is fatal, right? So we are the testing ground for that, so we are in the spider's web, and हम खुशी से इसमें हमारे जो बड़े हैं मुक़्तदर लोग हैं वो खुशी से इस वेब में रहते हैं, because उनके लिए तो फ़ायदे हैं, but बाकी हम इसका सारा जो है ना वो उठाते हैं 25 करोड़ आवाम जो है.
So, I think it's a very difficult question to answer, because there are plenty of countries that have had close relationships with the West or US and have still developed reasonably well. There are others who haven't. And so, I don't know how to decompose such a relationship to say how strong the causality link is, because I always feel the ultimate responsibility for making an implementation of policy within Pakistan is on each one of us. We are responsible for the 250 million here, and we can't really shift responsibility in that sense, whether our relationships are good or bad. Mm-hmm. So in that sense, I want to keep the debate in a way, irrespective of the relationship. The people who've been in power, the people who are responsible are here. And we have to get answers from them and suggest ways forward for them.
Can I just sort of elaborate on this? I think एक बड़ा important जो channel है ना, जो इसी से link बनता है, जो Dr. Umar बात कर रहे हैं. Let's not forget कि, obviously by now you've guessed I'm a conspiracy theorist, so I'm sure you'll put me in that slot. But there is, the last 3 years हमने एक चीज़ देखी है. ये जो बातें थी ना कि एक इंटरनेशनल एस्टैब्लिशमेंट है और वो एलीट्स को प्रॉप अप करती है अपने क्लाइंट स्टेट्स में, वो हमने अब देख लिया, राइट? सो दिस इज नो लॉन्गर अ कंस्पिरेसी थियोरी. एक क्लाइंट स्टेट का एक हमारा माइंडसेट है और हमारी एलीट है जो साइंस अप टू दिस मर्सनरी वॉर्स, जियोपॉलिटिकल रेंट्स, एटसेट्रा एटसेट्रा. सो दिस इज द ग्रोथ मॉडल दैट दे वांट टू फॉलो, एंड वी आर सीइंग दैट. एंड अंटिल वी डिच दिस मॉडल, एंड मे बी डिच द एलीट एज वेल, द रूलिंग एलीट, हमारा कोई फ्यूचर नहीं है, to be honest. So this model has to change, and there is a deep connection between the US, the West, and client-state relationship with an extractive elite.
So I think that's a good question, and so my follow-up, which I want to bring Sven, Umar, and Rabia, you guys in to comment on this, is let's substitute US, which you said, and Saqib Saab expanded it and he said the West. But I want to look at it more from the point of view of capitalism. Perhaps that's the main anchoring point that we should be thinking about. I mentioned that, growth is a core economic, macroeconomic policy for countries. But growth is also a very defining aspect of capitalism. When we're talking about corporate operations, they need to grow quarter on quarter. And I'm wondering if it is coincidental that this is the case, or are they actually linked? Which is to say, is there a scenario that you can have, do we require growth because we are all capitalist economies? Or can you have a non-capitalist economy that is also growth focused? So what is that linkage, right, with capitalism, growth, and to your question on this, the US flirtatious relationship and so on, maybe it is capitalism that is that element that we need to consider and its impact on our economic governance. So over to you guys. Sven.
This is on. Yes. No, I think that's a great question, and I think it. First of all, thanks for letting me be here. Sorry for being late. Assalamu alaikum. I see the question of growth and capitalism as one of a pretty basic difference between growth and profit, right? We talked a little bit about growth and what it means and how we define it. So let me just briefly share how I look at growth, which is through the lens of systems thinker Donella Meadows, who put growth as throughput, right? And it all depends on what you focus on as a country. If you focus on GDP, you're going to be increasing GDP. If you focus on welfare, equity, justice, you're going to focus on increasing welfare, equity, justice. Now, the sort of standard presumption of most policymakers, I think, is, as you mentioned, you increase growth and all these positive things will happen to our country, right? It's a heuristic device. So that's one thing, that's growth. But now if we look at profit, something very different happens. So the relationship between growth and profit, I think, just very, very brusquely can be put into two numbers. One is that if we put all the global public debt together, you end up at something like 100 trillion US dollars, right? Now, if you look at capital flows, so daily transactions between countries, and you look at forex markets, that's $10 trillion every day. So there's a huge kind of differential between what we do on the level of the country and what happens in the global economy, and especially with regards to financial flows. Now, what I find so interesting is that policymakers don't just pursue growth. They have to, on some level, where they feel they have to facilitate profit. They have to facilitate industrial investment. They have to attract these flows, right? What's really interesting there is that those flows don't necessarily, obviously, benefit most people, but they seem to be a prerequisite. There is this meme, which I love, which is, to understand capitalism, you should just replace the word economy with rich people's yacht money. So is the economy doing well? Well, is it going well with rich people's yacht money, right? Like this points at this differential between like what we call the 1% and the 99%. So to me, this is a very crucial difference to understand. And let me just finish with one example, which is that you can have a lot of profit when an economy breaks down. You can have a lot of profit when it goes wrong with a country. Profit can exist in a situation where growth is faltering, or when it's going really bad with a country. And you need to look no further than the US, I think, right? People who cannot afford diabetic medicine, huge parts of the social fabric deconstructing, and a lot of profits to be made. So I think you have to really separate growth and profits.
So just before the others join in, I want for my own sake clarification, perhaps for the audience as well. What we're seeing in the US and some of these developed markets is actually a disconnect now between profit and growth, where you can actually have wealth creation and growth without having profits. And the startup sector, for example, is a very, is a case in point where you have Amazon and Uber and these companies year on year, they're burning through money, yet they're generating wealth because the growth is what is creating asset valuations. And somehow that also works. So more recently, I think that profit element has been kind of taken out. And is that only at a corporate level, or do you see that at a national level as well, when you separate growth and profit and say we need to look at?
Well, just very briefly, because I also would love to hear from the rest, but I think it all depends on what you measure, right? Like, what do you focus on? And I think it's great that we have more initiatives that don't seem to depend on profit, as you suggest, but I'm also very wary of this kind of, I don't know how to put it, but let's pick the example. We have this huge vegan wave right now where we don't like eating meat, right? It's very fancy and trendy. But if 5% of the population does that and 95% does not, then it doesn't really matter. So even if you have 5% of businesses that are, let's say, less profit-oriented or embrace new business models, unless that kickstarts a broader conversion, it won't necessarily impact the national economy, I think.
Thank you for this question. This is actually a very burgeoning area of research in economics, particularly growth critical research. So if any of the students want to look it up, you can look for growth dependence and imperative literature, and you'll find hundreds of academic articles on this. So the approach this research takes is that it looks at capitalism as a system and its components, the components being the firms, the households, and the relationships between them, and it particularly focuses on where conflicts are created. Why they do that? Because when conflicts are created, growth can be used as a term, as a solution to mediate those conflicts, to resolve those conflicts, at least temporarily. So capitalism creates certain relationships between economic actors that are inherently in conflict. So let's talk about a few of those relationships. There are many that can be talked about, but I'll focus on just a few. So the first one is the famous one from the 20th century, the conflict between workers and capitalists, right? So whenever workers in an enterprise, workers and capitalists get together, they produce some kind of surplus, and then there's a conflict between how to split that, right? So growth can be used as a way to mediate that conflict. So I'll give an example. Let's say in a particular firm, it is creating 100 units of surplus, right? So if that happens and the split is, let's say, 30-70, the group that is getting 30, they might want a 50-50 split. Now, if next year the surplus creation is of 200 units, now the group that was getting lesser now can get 60. And then the other one gets 140. So the 50 demand is met. But next year, then the demands will increase again for an even split. So this kind of creates this ongoing conflict, and then ongoing resolution happens through growth. Another relationship is between the different firms that are locked in competition with each other, right? They're looking to take each other's market share. Now, one way of doing that is scaling up your business and using economies of scale to drive down costs. So if that happens, then by definition, companies need to grow, right? They grow their business, grow their productive capacity, achieve some kind of skill. So that also becomes a growth imperative for firms. Then there's the imperatives of big finance, right? If a company is issuing debt or issuing equity, then they have some external investors. Look at the companies in the US and Wall Street. They will demand a certain amount of return on that investment. So how can the return come? Only through growth. Finally, I want to talk about the logic of production under capitalism. So under capitalism, we don't produce necessarily for need satisfaction of any kind. We are producing things for profit, right? So anything that can be sold will be produced, right? Which leads to all kinds of, you might say, superfluous production. So think about fast fashion, right? Clothing is a basic necessity, but now with fast fashion firms, what we see is that clothes just last 2 weeks long. They can barely go through 3 washes, and then they disintegrate. And so what happens? Now you got to go out and buy more, produce more. So in this way, these like some of the relationships between different actors within capitalism, they create the imperatives and dependence on growth. So when we analyze capitalism as a system like this and understand how its logic unfolds over time, we see that growth is central to the stability of the system, right? If growth is not happening, all these conflicts become sharper and sharper, and the system itself can collapse. So growth is required for capitalism to survive. So to your original question where you were saying, is a capitalism without growth possible? I think the answer to that is no. And we see that happen in real life with recessions, right? What happens when growth, God forbid, goes down, right? It becomes negative. It's called a recession. And in a recession, we see all manner of social costs imposed on a society. Like there are job losses, there can be bankruptcies, mortgage defaults, you name it. So I think that's, in this way, capitalism is very dependent on growth. And like you were alluding to, we need to think of a different logic of production, a logic based on necessity, a logic based on sufficiency for us to move beyond capitalism, because as long as we're stuck with it, we would need some kind of growth to happen.
Thanks. So just taking on that, and maybe Rabia, I can change the question a little bit because and focus on some of the dichotomies that have been mentioned. Omar said that growth, capitalism without growth is not possible. And Sven talked about how you have to separate growth and profit. But the other dichotomy that I see is that capitalism as a historical framework or an economic principle has not always existed, right? And anthropologically, society goes back much longer. So in your work or in your research, have you seen any impact or any pushback or reaction to sort of this growth-centric, and increasingly so, because social media is a big driver of consumption culture and so on. Do you see any disconnect between this capitalist impetus for constant growth and sort of what you're seeing in terms of either the younger generation pushing back or dissenting or objecting or reacting to it in mental health ways or anything? Is there a dichotomy that you see?
Thank you. Thank you so much. just want to thank Harun for putting together such an excellent panel. As a cultural anthropologist, I definitely want to sort of come from a different angle, perhaps a little bit sort of meta-analytically. I do think that if you're not familiar with anthropology, we are very much interested in what Dr. Bari said about thinking through what matters to humans, right, at its core. Just to answer sort of maybe your previous question, Harun, a little bit, when we approach capitalism within our discipline, I think it is very much more so thinking about it as a political ideology more than anything else. I think that's key, right? I think aspirations towards growth or ideas of well-being, productivity, progress, often try to aim for a uniform sort of one-size-fits-all, often Eurocentric model, which I think we all are. I don't think we're not in disagreement that that's very, very problematic. But I think that we need to sort of also change and try to think of progress or visions of progress in a way that it pushes back against that uniformity, that is differentiated in terms of thinking about particular populations and communities, and especially particular populations and communities that are most vulnerable, and in intersectional ways. And what I mean by that is that we can think of the different ways. Hina brought up women, for example, that, of course, if you're a woman from a particular class, your sort of the way in which capitalism impacts you is going to be very different from women of a working class background, right? So I think the complexities of trying to understand this is difficult. I think, part of what I would want to argue is that we do have to think and take the idea of holistic research very seriously. That when we're thinking about economics or growth, we can't just think about policy and health or education, but also very much so media, politics, religion, cultural norms in the way in which they're essential to sort of the economic trajectory. Part of that also involves thinking in a different way or being critical about our own sort of epistemological approach as well as methodological approach. A lot of research tends to be rushed, right? Whether it's in economics, whether it's policy-driven, whether it's academic, NGOs, because we are on this particular kind of neoliberal framework or timeline where we have funding and we have to get results quickly and we have to collect data quickly. And I think, not to stray too much, but I do feel like what we need is time and immersive qualitative research if we really want to get at the human need, right? The human sort of being able to, I think academically, institutionally, I think capitalism and sort of neoliberalism still primarily serves the 1%, whether we're thinking provincially, nationally, regionally, globally, right? And so I think we have to move away from this kind of cohesive attempt to approach these concepts and the idea of growth in a uniform way, whether that's replacing what we have with something different that's equally uniform, because I think that can be problematic as well. But I think even at the heart of it, sort of a lot of us as privileged individuals would have to give up quite a bit in thinking about sort of long-term sustainable growth. So I know that didn't directly answer your question, but I hope it.
I'll circle back because I do want to see, in your research, what the pushback or the dissent and the reaction, because I myself have seen this, right? And I've learned a lot in the last 2 years. The world has changed a lot, and I'm eager to see from someone who's doing research and is closer to the younger generation because you teach, what are you seeing in terms of their reaction to this capitalist push? But I will move on with Dr. Bari, you very eloquently put that when you ask people how they're doing, they don't talk about their last quarter growth. They talk about their personal health and well-being and so on. And in that context, I'd like to bring Fiza, Hina, and Davar. By the way, Davar, we introduced you while you were not here. Davar Bhatt, ladies and gentlemen, he's a resident climate activist, and he's so committed to reducing his carbon footprint that he had his plane fly slower, and that's why he was late. But, we are grateful for that. But Fiza, I'll start off with you a little bit. Urbanization is one of the effects of growth, right? People move to cities, they look for work and so on. but at the same time, it also contributes to growth because you have mix of ideas and access to labor and opportunities and so on. But then too much urban congestion can start to hinder growth and adversely impact quality of life and raise up costs of transport and cost of living and so on. And our similarly, climate also has a two-way relationship, right, where climate and the environment is both impacted by growth, but the available resources and sort of the environment around you affects your propensity for growth. So to what degree within these two-way relationships is it a net positive, right? Can it always, and can you design it so that there is a net positive? So you have sustainable growth, but you have a net positive impact on urbanization and on the environment. And to what degree inherently over the long term will we see degradation, right? Which is a question ultimately about the sustainability of sustainable growth, perpetual growth.
Great, thank you, Harun, and thanks for organizing this. It's been really great to hear everyone's viewpoints. And you're absolutely right. Economic growth facilitates urbanization, and this is a two-way street. So urbanization also facilitates economic growth. When we're concentrated in one particular place, you have agglomeration economies. You benefit from firms being close to one another, people being close to one another. Resources are shared, ideally more equitably, and also there's greater exchange of ideas. So there's lots of advantages of urbanization that can contribute to economic growth particularly. But I think, as we've also been discussing so far, it's not inevitable that this kind of growth will necessarily result in more inclusivity, more sustainability. That's not automatically the case, as it is with economic growth in general. And I think about, if we're just thinking about this relationship between urbanization and economic growth in general, just to really drive the point home, when we think about industrialization, that happened in Britain in the 18th, 19th century. And that's a time when, there's a lot of wealth being produced, a lot of economic activity. But at the same time, in those cities, in England cities also, you see that there was a lot of squalor, new slums being developed. There were terrible health conditions, to the degree that the cholera outbreaks. And what stopped it was in direct government intervention and changes in legislation.
Spread some of those gains that we could be calling imperial loot to some of its citizenry, right? So that's why you see you better living standards in a country like US or UK or any other global north country, but we are not there in the imperial hierarchy. So we need to take that dimension into account as well.
So Harun, I think this is a great question, and in fact, Dr. Umar ne koi baat ki thi. So when we come back from lunch, Umar, something for you that you need to answer कि elite capture से कैसे निकले, ये वाला elite capture. But जो आपका जो point है, उसमें जो मेरा जो point of view है, वो ये है कि पहली बात है कि हर country में the elite capture is not similar. Right, as we know from Acemoglu and Robinson as well, there's extractive, and there's some tiny bits that are inclusive elites, but generally they're extractive. But how extractive they are obviously not the same, right? So in Pakistan's case, you're absolutely right. We're extreme now. Secondly, within the countries, things are not static. So if I was, if maybe 10 years ago, I used to ask this question: why is America great, or what made America great? And generally, my friends say, innovation, free markets, etc. I don't buy that. America was made great by legislation, civil rights legislation, by the G.I. Joe bill, for example, etc., etc. So many pieces of legislation that actively sought to bring vulnerable segments of society up, right? Provide opportunities for a vast amount of their society. So that elite, be it FDR, be it, even Lyndon B. Johnson, somebody very unlikely to think about other people, let's say. But, though they thought about segments of people and how to bring them up, right? And how to spread opportunity. So that's what made America great then. And that elite has gone. That elite is now converted into Elon Musk and Donald Trumps of the world. right? So we're saying that, you know, countries are not static, the elites are not static, and all countries are not the same.
We'll break with that. I think we've had a good discussion so far on some of the issues, and in the second half now we'll start talking about the solutions and how to break out, and including the question on how to break the elite capture and so on. Thank you, everyone. Audience.